Good evening. This video is hopefully just a brief video that helps to explain how the concept of pragmatism, as William James understands it, relates to his presentation of religious experience in the Varieties of Religious Experience. A few of you asked about how pragmatism related, so hopefully this video will help with that. All of the information I'm going to be taking out of the second chapter on his work Pragmatism, which was also a series of lectures. Chapter 2 is entitled What is Pragmatism? Now, behind me, I don't usually use the dry erase board, but the first story he tells about the squirrel and the person that go around the tree is somewhat hard to conceptualize initially. And so if you look behind me, you see what I tried my best to draw a squirrel. That's a squirrel and a human being, and they're on opposite ends of the tree. And what he describes, he being William James, is whenever the person tries to move towards the squirrel moves in the opposite direction. So both the person and the squirrel circle the tree, but the philosophical, or kind of jokingly philosophical question is, does the person ever go around the squirrel? So this situation occurs when William James and his friends go on a camping trip, and he walks a bit ahead of the group. And as he's away from the group members uh, start to debate this question. And there's an equal amount of them that are debating which one it is. Half of the people think that the person goes around the squirrel, and the other half think that the person and the squirrel go around the tree, but that the person doesn't go around the squirrel. And they're waiting for William James to get back to essentially settle this debate. And you can kind of see he might be hinting at how philosophers debate about things that are of no value, perhaps. It's somewhat unclear whether they just get into trivial debates, so to speak. But when he comes back, he uses the situation to introduce pragmatism, and he basically says the debate is meaningless. If by what you mean by does the person go around the squirrel, uh, um, you mean the person goes around where the squirrel once was, then of course. And if you mean by the person going around the squirrel, that the person actually overtakes the squirrel in going around the tree, then the answer is obviously false. But the way that we're having the debate is that these two different things, um, two different ways of saying something, mean the same thing, right? The person going around the squirrel uh, could mean the former, in which case it's yes, or it could mean the latter, in which case it's no. And so he uses this idea to begin his discussion of pragmatism. And he says what distinguishes two things, um, well, possibly two things. What distinguishes that one idea is actually a single idea and not two ideas, is that it would produce different action. Right? If it would produce any different action, then it might just be the same thing worded in two different ways, much like this argument about this person going around the squirrel. And so then he gives a list of more philosophical topics, such as was the world created, or did it always exist? Are we free, or are determined? Or are we determined? Are there many substances, or just a unity? Um, Now, are these debates like the debate about the squirrel and the person going around the squirrel? He says, well, they are if at the end of the day, when you ask the question and one person says, oh, I believe that, say, the earth was created, the universe was created, and the other person says, no, I believe rather that it was eternal. If it doesn't produce any different action, then James is going to argue that it's the same belief. And so pragmatism takes its root from the word pragma, which is the Greek word for action. And this is how he begins to introduce the notion of pragmatism. Then, toward the end of the chapter, the last few paragraphs, he draws out this particular line of thought that would probably be more relevant for the varieties of religious experience. He asks, is there a way that we ought to live? And he doesn't necessarily mean objectively or universally. He just means psychologically. Do people think there's a way they ought to live? When they make decisions, do they think, oh, there's certain things I should do and certain things I shouldn't do? You could apply it objectively too. And this is where it might get interesting and relate more to the varieties. When he asked the question in the circumscription of the topic, when he's trying to present definitions of religion, for example, he uses the definition of organs in the medical approach as an analogy. When you ask, well, what does this organ do that no other organ can do? And that's its function or definition. And he asks the same about religion. What does it do that nothing else can do? And his answer generally is that it makes morality pleasant or enjoyable. And this is something he distinguishes from what he calls the philosophical or the Stoic approach. The Stoic approach, you can do what you believe is right or what you ought to do, but it's not pleasant. You just sort of do it out of duty, or it's sort of drudgery, but you can still do it. Whereas whereas with religion, it makes it more pleasant what you ought to do. Um, and so the first question he asked toward the end of the second lecture on pragmatism is there a way we ought to live? And he argues that most will say yes. And then the second question he asked that's related is, are there beliefs that, if believed, would help us live the way we ought to live? And the answer there, he thinks, is also yes. And so he says, well, then ought we to believe them? And most people would argue, then yes, if those beliefs help us to live the way we ought to live, then we ought to believe them. And he takes the further step and he says, for the pragmatist, when one says we ought to believe something, that is the same as saying that is true. The belief is true. And this is what he admits is the startling idea about pragmatism, that something is true if we ought to believe it. And this seems to contradict or go against, say, for example, correspondence theories of truth. And he's well aware of it. But instead of saying something is true because we ought to believe it, I think perhaps a more interesting way of looking at it is to go back to the beginning, which is the story he gives about the squirrel and the person going around the tree, and whether the person actually goes around the squirrel. And suppose we think there's a way we ought to live, and there's a belief, and we'll just call this belief A, that helps us to live that way to a particular degree. And there's belief B that also helps us to live the way we ought to live to the same degree. Then I think William James would argue that those two beliefs are the same thing, and they're true in that they produce the same action. And that might be a way of looking at it. Now, when he organizes the varieties of religious experience, he'll also claim that religion is one's total reaction upon life. And so he will look and he will give varieties of people's total reactions upon life. And those reactions or actions are the fruits of religious experience. The roots, he doesn't care about where they came from because they're producing the same type of action, total reactions upon life. And in that sense, they're the same thing. His audience may be concerned to a certain degree about roots, saying for certain things, perhaps that isn't religion, such as you get the sense of that with the mind cure. But he's going to argue, no, it is, in that it produces this total reaction upon life. So hopefully that helps answer the question. I've included the second chapter of Pragmatism on the Canvas page for you to look at along with this video. Hopefully this helps. This wasn't part of the course per se, but it was just an answer to a question a few of you were asking, which I think is a really good question. And so hopefully this helps. All right, take care.